Welcome to Cover, the show that looks at authors, books, and all the pages in between. I'm your host, Louisa Bottaraco. Tonight, we take a look at what's being called financial fiction, where real-world hedge fund gurus meet murder and intrigue. We'll be taking a look at friendship and how it's had a surprisingly profound effect on world events, and we'll catch up with an author who tapped into her inner band geek for inspiration for her latest novel. But my first guest is a graduate of Harvard Business School who's worked on Wall Street at iconic institutions. Now he writes well-known financial thrillers, blending fiction and nonfiction in none other than his old stomping grounds in Lower Manhattan. I'd like to welcome Norb Vonnegut. Thank you for joining us, Norb.
Thanks for having me here, Louisa.
Now, I'd like to start with your name. It's a very interesting name, Norb. Interesting for sure, but I want to talk about your last name. There's another writer in the family, is there not?
There are a couple of writers, actually, and we're all related. If you see a Vonnegut out there, say hello for me, because we all date back to the same clan.
Okay.
And Kurt was my fourth cousin and a source of inspiration every day in many ways, as you might imagine.
Wonderful. And how many times an hour do you have to answer that question?
Usually I say fourth cousin, and then it ends.
Got it.
But
Okay.
I've had answers throughout my career, and no matter what I say, it usually ends up being my father, my brother, my uncle. The only thing no one has ever accused Kurt of being is my mother. So.
Good, good. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about financial fiction. So what are we talking about when we talk about a fictitious Wall Street? Are we talking about make-believe things like accountability and ethics, or where's the fiction, where are the facts?
Well, I don't really think of it as financial fiction.
Okay.
I just think of it as a thriller.
Okay.
Wall Street was my life for 20 years. And what I like in stories are when ordinary people get swept away by circumstances beyond their control, and they rise above themselves to do really great things. And so when I think about books that I write, sure, they take place on Wall Street, but just ordinary guys getting swept away, ordinary women getting swept away by the circumstances that overcome them.
Got it. So Wall Street, to you, totally ordinary people. Nothing else going on, nothing special, you think?
Well, Wall Street is a really wonderful place. There are characters, and I could tell you that I probably have enough material from my days on Wall Street to write thrillers for the next 50 years.
Okay.
I mean, the things that I saw on a regular basis were just crazy. And in my fiction, The Trust, my most recent book, and my earlier books, I've always talked about vignettes. And things that happen to people. So one of the stories I like to tell, and which I actually told in the top producer of my first book, is about a stockbroker who had some clients in from the Midwest, and they met behind closed doors all day, and they went until the late hours, and finally they decided to go out to dinner. And after dinner, they went to a strip bar. Now that's a kiss of death for stockbrokers, no matter what you read in the papers, because it's a surefire way to get in trouble. And the stockbroker himself didn't want to go to the strip bar with these two clients, but they insisted. And so he walked into the strip bar, and he's trying to hide, and of course they're going right to the front, right to sit underneath the stand. And what happens? The woman sees him, the woman who's dancing, she sees him. Her hands are like this, and she covers up, and she runs off the stage, and she's screaming, and everybody's wondering what happened. And all of a sudden, these three bouncers jump on the stockbroker, they jump on his clients, they pull them outside, and they're about to hit him. And they said, "What did you say to that poor girl? What did you say to her?" And the stockbroker said, "She's my nanny." So I have great stories like that from my days on the street.
All right.
I love telling them.
Okay. So are you saying you're doing all this from memory, or were you taking notes while you were at Morgan Stanley and Payne Weber? I mean, how much of this is from memory, and how much of this did you know you're going to be doing when you were on Wall Street?
I didn't know I was going to do it, but I remember stories from forever. I mean, if somebody tells me a story, I remember it. I'm not so good on names, but stories I'm really good at.
Okay.
I remember them.
So are former colleagues still talking to you, knowing what you're doing, or are they a little worried that they're somehow going to land in one of these plots?
Well, the thing is my former colleagues are actually thrilled, and the reason is that Wall Street's an easy place to pick on these days. We had 2008, and all of a sudden, everybody thinks that every villain in the history of mankind has come from Wall Street.
Sure.
And if you read my novels, The Trust, The Top Producer, The Gods of Greenwich, you'll find that my villains come from Wall Street. It's not hard to find a few there, but so do my heroes. We get a really balanced perspective of the industry. And that, I think, is a good message because it's too easy to blame the institutions that we really need to rely on to improve our economy today.
Sure. So in this constant stream of op-eds and presidential stump speeches and documentaries, do you think that Wall Street is getting its fair shake?
Oh, I think that Wall Street has made a lot of mistakes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, what I feel personally is that maybe 5% of the people on Wall Street are getting 80% of the press. And there are plenty of really good people who try to do the right thing on the street.
Sure.
And in my books, they're just the characters. They're the villains, they're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and they're the peripheral characters. But because the language is fun, because just the charging momentum of what it takes to get out and trade bonds or to trade stocks, it's so kinetic, and it makes a great backdrop to tell a story about the emotions that we all understand: friendship, betrayal, love, anger.
Right. Right. And this reoccurring character, Grove O'Rourke, is he based on anyone in real life, or?
I think there's a little Grove in all of us.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is that Grove is a guy who's overwhelmed by the events around him. He just walks into trouble. No matter where he goes, he walks into trouble. And he's not a superhuman, although he is an outstanding bicyclist. He's a really good bicyclist. And he's not the smartest guy around. Sometimes he misses things, but you can really rely on him. He's a guy you want in your foxhole. And so when I think about Grove, I think that he resembles a lot of people with whom I've worked.
And in this latest book, The Trust, he takes on community foundations, correct?
Yeah, and there's a good story behind that. When I was in my early days at Morgan Stanley as a stockbroker, we used to keep what we called the bad guy list. And that was a list of bad guys that we didn't want to do business with. Now, one time, we had a call, my team had a call from this fellow who said he wanted to deposit $50 million with us. Now, we had a huge business. At our high point, we managed $2 billion in total. And what I can tell you is that nobody ever calls out of the blue and says, I want you to manage $50 million. It never happens.
Sure.
So we met with him, and it turned out that he was Pablo Escobar's first cousin. And we wouldn't have known this. It was pre-Google, and even now with Google, there are bad days. But the point is that we submitted his name through Morgan Stanley, and we had the bad guy list. Now, in The Trust, I've written about a community foundation, because so often in my own practice, I worked with really wealthy families who created private foundations, or they created community foundations, and they didn't have the resources to keep an eye out for the bad guys. Even though they invested lots of money, they didn't have teams and teams of lawyers or a compliance division or money to throw at chasing the folks that they didn't want to do business with. And so I thought it would be really interesting to write a book about a small community foundation that runs into the bad guys because they don't have a list. And that's what The Trust is about.
Your new book, The Trust, tell me where it begins.
Well, early on, there's a fellow driving down I-95 outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. Have you ever been on that road during the
I
summer?
haven't had the pleasure.
It's hot.
Okay.
It's hot and it's dusty, and the only things that keep you from falling asleep are the billboards or the bugs that splatter against the windshields. And so this fellow who's driving in the car, he looks up and he sees a huge billboard. And at the very top, now the thing you have to understand about billboards is that they're no longer painted. They're done in tarps. This is the sort of thing I never thought I'd study as a broker at Morgan Stanley. But the billboards are tarps. They're really heavy, and they're pulled up to the top of the billboard platform. And so the fellow sees the top third of this tarp, and it says HIP, 20,000 square feet of retail space opening next week. And thinks, this is great. And I wonder what kind of store it is. And so then he sees that there's a woman who looks a lot like Angelina Jolie, and she's about to eat a chocolate-covered strawberry. And he thinks, that's great, that's in the middle, and what kind of store is this? And so the final third of the top is unrolled, and it says, highly intimate pleasures, your store for all of your adult needs. And so he thinks, this is terrible, because there's an adult superstore opening up in his backyard, and in his backyard, outside exit 55, are roughly 54 churches, of which 27 of them are Baptist. And so the neighborhood goes up in arms. Of course they're upset. And they hire a lawyer of some renown. His name is Biscuit Hughes. And he's won big cases against developers in the past. And they expect Biscuit to keep highly intimate pleasures out of their backyard. And they say to him, Biscuit, what are you going to do? Now, he's a big man, but he's nervous. And because he has bad news for them. And he says, I'm not sure. Well, what do you mean you're not sure? He said, well, usually I find out bad things about the owners. Well, just do it, Biscuit. Find out some bad things about highly intimate pleasures. And he says, well, it's not so easy this time. Why not? He says, well, they're owned by a foundation. Well, what kind of foundation? Well, it's based in Virginia, he says, in D.C. And they said, well, answer the question, Biscuit. What's the name of this foundation? He says, it's the Catholic Fund. And of course, everybody in this community is aghast. What is the Catholic Fund doing, owning an adult superstore outside Fayetteville, North Carolina?
Right.
And that's the question I pose early in the book. Now, for the Catholics in our audience, I just want you to know that I got dispensation from our family priest, and it ends okay.
Okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was getting a little worried. Well, it sounds like a fascinating read.
It'll pull you in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. I think that's all the time we have for today. But thank you very much for joining us. The book is called The Trust by Noor Vonnegut. Thank you for joining us, and best of luck.
Great. Thanks for having me here.
Up next, an author and professor who counts friendship as one of the bedrocks of society. My next guest describes friendships as messy and open, with no clear rules. But he says they've also laid the foundation for some of the major social movements of our time. Joining us now is Dr. Tom Roach. Thank you, Tom, for being with us here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the title of your book, Friendship as a Way of Life, Foucault, AIDS, and the Politics of Shared Estrangement. It's a mouthful, and I want you to tell our viewers why they shouldn't be afraid to read it.
It is a mouthful, there's no doubt about it, and that's so typical of academic books, because we love our words and we love to make things big and grandiose in one way or another. But it's not an intimidating book at all.
All right.
What it is in fact, a book about friendship. And friendship I take seriously. Obviously, like you said, I describe them as open, as sort of malleable, as sort of less categorizable than other forms of relationship, like family relationships or marriage or kinship or these various other relationships that we seem to take more seriously and that we seem to think are in one way or another superior to friendship.
Sure. So are we looking at specific friendships throughout time, or are we talking about more general concept of, you know, the evolution of friendship over time?
It was a little bit of both. I mean, I'm a philosopher, I'm trained in philosophy, and I was thinking about the philosophy of friendship in the Western philosophical tradition. And I wrote the book specifically because this one philosopher, Michel Foucault, who appears in the title, he had things to say about friendship that sort of went against the grain of people like Plato and Aristotle and these other more foundational philosophers.
Okay.
So I wanted to explore what he had to say about friendship, but then also think about a politics of friendship and how friendship, in all of its messy malleability, in many ways forms the bedrock for some of these really important social movements, as you mentioned.
Right.
Specifically, I look at AIDS activism.
Great. And what was so revolutionary of what Foucault had to say about friendship?
Well, these are really disturbing friendships that he was talking about and that he had in his life. So I, in fact, analyze and do some sort of biographical history of his friendships in his life. and look at how he treated his friends and look at the theories of friendship that emerged between these friends. And it's, for instance, they betrayed each other a lot. They were not necessarily nice to each other or personal to each other in the way that people think, oh, your friend is your most personal. It's like they just reflect you and they are your soulmate or what have you. These were very difficult friendships. And what I found in those friendships was that, and that's why I call it shared estrangement. And what I saw in those difficult friendships, I saw them sort of mirrored or at least reflected in those important and powerful friendships that developed in the AIDS crisis in the early 1980s.
Sure.
And so I sort of link Foucault's theory of friendship with the actual friendships that form the bedrock of AIDS activism.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about AIDS activism. Specifically, how did what Foucault have to say about, you know, these disturbing friendships? How did that manifest itself in activism?
That's a good question, because what happened during the AIDS crisis, I think, well, America didn't deal with AIDS very well. And what happened was, imagine if you were gay in 1981, you were diagnosed with HIV, your family was already uncomfortable, if not, they deserted you already. The federal government wasn't doing too much to help people out, so who did you turn to but your friends? So your friends became your therapist, your caregiver, your home health aide. They became everything to you. And I'm thinking of this concept of shared estrangement as precisely that. Like, here are a bunch of people who are kind of outcast from us. They're estranged from dominant society, from mainstream society. But in one way or another, they're also estranged from each other, because oftentimes one is deathly ill and the others are healthy, and they're just trying to help all of their ailing friends. So that moment of AIDS caregiving and the way in which friendship blossomed in that moment, I would say also sort of turned into or evolved into this very powerful form of activism with groups like ACT UP and other various AIDS activist groups. And I think it's precisely that moment of AIDS caregiving and the friendships that emerged in that moment that developed into this very creative and interesting and amazing activism.
Sure, it's not just the daily, you know, getting by and coping with the actual disease. It's, you know, what the larger sense of what that became. And do you find that that's still happening today in, you know, the fight to find a cure for AIDS? And do you find that friendship is still as important now as it was in the 1980s? I do,
and don't forget AIDS, please, but thinking differently now, I'm thinking about all the various social media sites now and the way in which the friendships that develop in those social media sites are so important to new forms of political activism, like Arab Spring, like Occupy Wall Street, all of these sort of more grassroots political movements that are happening right now, and the role that friendship is continuing to play in the formation of those. But my next project, I'm really interested in looking at social media and how the friendships that develop in a social media context are so different from, say, face-to-face friendships, but there's still something really interesting about the impersonal quality of those friendships and how that, maybe it's that impersonality, like the estrangement back then, that helps them blossom into these forms of political activism.
So what, in your opinion, as a friendship expert, what would you say is the biggest difference between a friend in the traditional sense of the word and then a friend as it's recently been defined, you know, in light of Facebook and whatnot?
I was talking to students about this the other day, and I was telling them about a flight I went on recently. I was going to San Diego, and I sat next to a perfect stranger, right? And I think I opened up to this person in the 5-hour flight more than I've opened up to anyone close to me in my entire life. So it's this, again, this impersonal element, which I find most interesting, in the way in which a certain form of impersonality can open you up more, the way in which you experiment a little bit more, you're a little more free, you're a little more, you don't have to be yourself because the stakes aren't nearly as high. Identity doesn't matter anymore. So you can become something different, or you can say exactly who you are that you would never say to your mom or your husband or your wife or your sister or what have you. So I'm interested in these sort of impersonal forms of relationships that are developing online and where they might be taken.
Sure. And do you find by any chance that that's uniquely American, or do you think that that sort of approach to impersonal relationships, do you think that's something that more universal about humanity?
I think, I mean, Foucault, and I talk about Michel Foucault and his former friend, Hervé Guibert, and you know, they were French. Maybe it is a Western European phenomenon. It's a good question. But I'm also thinking about how, you know, in terms of, again, the social media aspect of friendship and that version of friendship that we're just sort of getting our heads around right now. You know, in the Middle East, that was I would say that prompted these really powerful revolutionary actions.
Absolutely, to the extent the government then tries to shut down the social network.
Sure.
So, now you yourself are a professor at Bryant University. So you're obviously seeing students on a daily basis form lifelong friendships, you know, from their infancy to, you know, some, you know, 4 years later. By any chance, are they inspiring you in your understanding of modern day friendships?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that we're doing in class, I'm teaching a class right now, as a matter of fact, called Sexuality and Culture. And we look at, you know, there's shows that I have them watch, like we watch Sex and the City, and there's a new show on HBO called Girls. And I'm really interested specifically in these friendships that are developing between women being, in one way or another, an oppressed class throughout history, and how these female bonds have been so important to female empowerment, to women's rights, right? So I have them look at these shows and say, like, what if at the end of the Sex and the City, if these women just decided to say, our friendships are most important, we're going to cultivate our friendships and not worry about men anymore. We're not lesbians, we're not lesbians, we're not straight, we're not straight, we're going to be friends, right? And that's what I love about friendship, because it sort of blurs all of these really concretized categories that we have, these categories that we think are true and real and natural, when in fact, all of that messy stuff that moves in between them is what I'm most interested in.
Okay, great. And what was it specifically about friendship that initially sparked your interest?
It was reading Michel Foucault, this one interview he gave, and I basically stole the title of this interview because the magazine in which the interview appeared was called Friendship as a Way of Life. And it was just this really, like, you know, just an interview like this perhaps, but someone transcribed it and put it into a book. And he said all these amazing things about friendship between soldiers and friendship between gay men, and how he was saying that friendship was in fact the next step in politics. And so he's talking about and I had no idea what he meant. And I thought, I have to figure out what he meant. So what better way to do it than write a book about it?
The next step in politics, and by that he meant, you know, the actual social change that it can cause.
Yeah, like cultivating friendship as a political relation that can bring about social change.
Sure, great. And if you had your way, is there any way we could enhance the state of friendship to make it more, not legitimate, but I mean, you know, to give it more the credence that, you know, perhaps you'd like to see?
That's the thing, it's so taken for granted, right? And there's no friendship ceremony that's going to bestow legal rights upon this couple or what have you. And I don't want that. I don't necessarily need an institutionalized version of friendship, because what I like about friendship, or the way I'm arguing about friendship, is that in its very nature, it's sort of like, it exceeds the institutions, it exceeds the categories, and it's all of that messiness that I find, again, most interesting.
Okay, so the book is called Friendship as a Way of Life, Foucault, AIDS, and the Politics of Shared Estrangement. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
Coming up, a writer who says she didn't choose her audience, they chose her. Author Erin Dion joins us after the break. Her 8 years in band helped create the setting for her latest work. Known for creating universal characters that struggle with their parents and their own expectations, Erin Dion joins us on our program. Thank you, Erin, for being with us here.
Thank you.
So I first want to start by distinguishing between band and orchestra, okay? If only to appease our viewers who are orchestra fans, I don't want to lump them into the lowly band geek status. So what attracts someone to band as opposed to the loftier orchestra?
Well, I think there are some major differences between band and orchestra. First of all, an orchestra has string instruments, violin, viola, cello, whereas band is all wind instruments and percussion. So clarinets, flutes, saxophone, horns. So it's a different type of music that you play. Orchestral music is traditionally more of what you would consider classical music, Brahms, Bach. There are contemporary composers, but I think that instrumentalists who play those stringed instruments kind of lean more towards the more classical pieces. And the people who tend to pick up the wind instruments and join band, the range of work that's available is a lot wider. Everything from more classical and traditional composition to contemporary movie scores, for example. And then marching band is a whole other element on top of that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know there's concert band, there's school band, there's a marching band. Does everyone march, or is that I mean, I obviously was not in band. I was a theater geek, so I knew to keep the band geeks at bay. But I couldn't tell you the first thing about who marches and who doesn't. So.
In marching band, basically, if you can carry it, you march with it.
Okay.
So even the percussion, the drummers wear their instruments on a harness, so they carry that. And then there are actually separate instrumentalists who will carry the cymbals for the drummers, so that they can stand and hold the cymbals and play. Basically, the only instrumentalists that don't march in a marching band would be pit percussion, so they would be like xylophone and marimba players. But otherwise, the tuba marches. It's a marching sousaphone, which wraps all the way around your body, all the way up to a piccolo, the tiniest.
And that's what you played.
That's what I played.
Piccolo, and you're also the flute. Right.
I played flute and piccolo, and I was the drum major in my high school marching band.
Excellent. Well, that brings me to my next question. So obviously, a band geek. They're at the lower rungs of high school, junior high. Is there a pecking order within band?
That's a good question. And, for the most part, I find marching band to be really collegial. And, you're all in it together. It's kind of like one big family. If there is a pecking order, it's more in terms of levels of experience.
Okay.
So the freshmen and the first year students who are just learning how to march and just learning the ropes of it, those are the students that tend to get a little bit more picked on. And then from there, presumably the longer you've been in, the more experience you have, the fewer mistakes you made. But if you, forget your instrument, or as in the case in the book, there's a student who forgets the plume for his hat, he has to endure some humiliation.
Got it. So it's a seniority thing primarily.
Exactly.
Okay, all right. Well, that seems fair. So one thing I don't get about band geeks is they're the ones who get the crowd going for the big game, and presumably they're the ones who would, one day welcome a president into a room. So they're clearly, hanging with the cool crowd, but they're just forever playing second fiddle, if you will. Doesn't that act get old?
Well, I think you do it because you love it, and then it's what you're passionate about. So no, it never really gets old.
No.
It's always something. Every performance is exciting, no matter what you're doing, whether you're playing in a pep band on the sidelines of a football game, or if you are playing. A lot of marching bands have played with groups like Fleetwood Mac on stage. The Dropkick Murphys here in Boston had the Boston College Band play with them. So being a band geek has its perks.
Okay. All right. And that's what your main character, Elsie, is. Now, I know that you have contributed to the anthology Dear Bully.
Yes.
70 authors shared their stories about bullying in school. Using Elsie as a model, what can adolescents do to make junior high a better place?
Well, I think junior high is a tough time for everybody. That's why I write about it. And I think there's no easy way to navigate the social scene, especially it seems for girls. They seem to have, to make a generalization, they seem to have a tougher time than boys. And I think the thing with all of my characters and all of my books, Elsie included, is having that level of confidence in yourself and feeling good about something that is close to you is what's most important. So Elsie has her music, and she's very confident in her music. Socially, she's very awkward, and it takes her a while to get her footing. But she uses her music becomes kind of a gateway to make friends, and to, band is the way that she ultimately kind of crosses those social boundaries. But it's hard, and I think that any kid has to find something within themselves to kind of hang on to during that tough time. It's really all about identity and learning who you are and having some confidence in yourself. And that's why bullying is so damaging. You know, it strips that away from kids.
Sure. And I know that you've partnered with the United States Scholastic Book Association for this.
I have two partners with this book, actually. The U.S. Scholastic Bands Association that puts on marching band competitions across the country has sponsored the book, and that's been really fun to travel to marching band competitions and meet readers and so many band geeks.
Are you like the god who brings all of this to the masses?
Well, you know, it's fun because a lot of the kids will come up and say, "I've never seen a book about a marching band before," or "Oh my gosh, I play mellophone, and this is, you know, and I play French horn when I'm in the off season," and so they get different kind of excited.
Okay. And the other partnership you mentioned.
The other partnership is with the Scholastic Book Fairs.
Okay.
And you know, when we all were kind of growing up, and you're in school, and you get the flyer with all the books in it every month.
Are they still doing that?
They are.
Oh, thank God. Because I loved that as a child, and I didn't know with like the advent of iPads and all that, if that was being phased out.
Yeah, they still do it.
iPads and Nooks, but it's great that still we have those little leaflets. And there's also an interaction you had with the band Cake, am I correct?
Yes.
Why did Cake take interest in the Accidental Band Geek?
It was kind of a serendipitous experience. Vince DiFiore, who plays trumpet for the band Cake, wrote an article about how important marching band was, and it was posted on CNN.com. And I saw the article the summer right before the book came out, and everything that he said, and he actually has never been in marching band, but he was talking about music education in general, and everything that he said really resonated with me and were things that I tried to capture in my book. And so as a fan, I sent him an email. I sent an email to the band, and I said, "Hey, you know, I saw this article on CNN.com. It was great. And I just wrote this book, and, you know, it has some of the same ideals in it." And I was sure that Cake doesn't read books for teenage girls, but lo and behold, they actually do.
Really?
And Vince emailed me back, and they've been big champions of the book. They were actually the ones that put me in touch with the USSBA, the Scholastic Bands Association, because they were running a contest with them. So Cake said to the USSBA, "Hey, check out this book," and that's how it all kind of came together.
Oh, how great.
So, you know, Cake is some big, major band geek.
So new.
Fun.
Now, and I did want to ask you about your next project, because you're working on this famously unsolved art theft at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Is there any sort of personal experience that you're drawing from this book that we should be knowing about, or?
The next book, Wreck Your Life and Solve a Mystery in 14 Days, comes out in 2013, and it is about the Isabella Stewart Gardner theft. And although, you know, I'm not an art thief, or I don't have the paintings hidden in my bedroom at home or anything like that, it was a uniquely Boston story that I wanted to tell, and I've been fascinated with the thefts myself, and so I decided to write about it. And all of my books are set in kind of a fictional suburb of Newton, and so there are little elements that kind of dovetail across all of the novels. So that's fun to kind of stitch those things together. But it's a different set of characters, and it's a whole different type of story.
Okay, all right, and it's for kids.
It's for kids, yeah.
How do you explain what's going on to children who may not even have heard of Rembrandt or Vermeer?
It was a challenge, but it was really fun. And basically the story is about this 13-year-old girl named Moxie, whose grandfather was a carpenter, basically for the mafia, and who hid things for various nefarious characters in Boston. And now he has Alzheimer's. And the person who actually stole the Gardner art is out of jail, wants the art, and Grandpa doesn't know where it is.
Convenient.
And it's up to Moxie to find it.
Interesting.
So she discovers things about her family that she didn't know along the way that she's searching for the paintings.
That's fascinating. Well, I can't wait to read that one. And I did want to ask, you mentioned that you didn't choose your audience chose you. How does that happen exactly?
You know, I'd been writing stories for adults for years, and they weren't very gripping or fun. One day I took a class actually at Emerson College on writing for children, and it just brought back all these memories for me about how much I loved reading during those. I still love to read, but when I was in junior high, you know, I slept with books under my pillow. I was always reading under the covers with a flashlight, and how important books were at that point for me. And I realized that that was the audience that really I should be reaching out to. And once I made that realization and those stories started coming, it really resonated for me. You know, it was kind of a perfect fit. And now I can't imagine writing for adults, actually.
There's no going back now.
No.
Well, good. Well, I'm so happy you could come visit us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Louisa.
Best of luck with everything. The book is called Notes from an Accidental Band Geek. And thank you very much again, Erin.
Thank you.
That's our show. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Louisa Badaracco, and we'll see you next time on Cover to Cover. Sorry, I have a question before we start.